Between Christmas and New Year's, I was thinking about getting ready for the material I wanted to cover this spring. I came across something that interested me and changed my mind completely and put together what I'm going to show you today. I was looking at the books that are concerned with the history, the biblical history, who wrote the biblical history. And one of the things that I noticed that struck me is that there are a number of different individuals that you can point to as being very instrumental in creating what we call biblical history. And they all had, I found, one thing in common. You know what that was? They were all called by God to do it. God instigated every one of these things. And I'm going to show you a little of that today. I can't show you everything, but for example, one of the important concepts that we have concerning biblical history is that there were a group of Semitic people living in Mesopotamia, way off to the east, who had migrated all the way down into Palestine, about 600-700 miles. Why did they leave Mesopotamia? Then when they got to Mesopotamia and got settled down there, we find out that they also became a nation. What resulted in them becoming a nation like Israel? Well, there were two people that were rather instrumental in this regard. We'll take a quick look at that once. One of them is Abraham. Abraham, well, we were told very early in the book of Genesis. By the way, I went through the whole problem of getting a way of doing this with a cordless mouse. That won't fit in here. Best played. Abraham was called. How was Abraham called? Now the Lord said to Abraham, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you, and I will make a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who curses you, I will curse. And by you all the families of the earth shall bless themselves." There we have Abraham. Now, that didn't happen in Chaldees. This happened after Abraham had moved with his wife and his nephew Lot, and would move with their father from Mesopotamia to Haran, which is way up in the upper part of Mesopotamia. And this is Abraham looking down at Canaan. Well, Canaan actually is about 500 miles from here, but he is told this is the land that you're going to go into, and that will be the land that will be where you will be the founder of a nation. God instigated that. One thing that bothered Abraham at that time is that he was 75 years old. And actually, when he went down there, he was there for about 15 years, and Sarah still had not had a child. But we find out that she's going to have a child. How? Well, it isn't because they prayed for it. What happened is that they had given up a long time before of ever hoping to have a child, because at this time, Sarah was almost 90 years old, and Abraham was about 100 years old when they were visited by three strangers. Well, the three strangers happened to be two angels and the Lord himself. Again, the Lord intervenes, and the Lord comes in and tells Abraham that he and Sarah will have a child. Now, you got to look at these pictures very carefully. This doesn't show up too well here. You know what's back here? Well, maybe you can see it better on this one there. Well, there you see her again. That is Sarah. Oh, that's the same picture. There's Sarah back there. Does anybody remember what Sarah did at this time? When Sarah found out that she was going to have a child at the age of 90, what did she do? She laughed. She laughed about it. Well, the angel said, so no, what God wants to happen will happen. It's interesting, they did have a child. His name was Isaac. I looked up the etymology on Isaac, and the word Isaac has something to do with laughter. In other words, it had to do with this incident of Sarah laughed at the idea of having a child at the age of 90. Let's move on a little bit to Jacob. The next person I want to talk about is Jacob. If we take a look at Jacob's life at this point, it's kind of interesting to say the very least. He is the son of Isaac, the grandson of Abraham. and Jacob's mother is Rebekah, Isaac's wife, and Rebekah and Isaac had one of the most dysfunctional families you could possibly imagine. They had two sons. They were twins. Esau, the older, was born just before Jacob. The father favored Esau, the mother favored Jacob, and there was a conflict in the family. Now, the way the situation existed at that time in their society, the birthright would be going to the older, which would be Esau. He didn't care about it that much. As a matter of fact, he was quite willing to sell his birthright to Jacob for a mess of pottage, a bowl of soup. And with the help of his mother, Jacob was able to finagle by deceiving Isaac, their father, to get the blessing from Isaac and to get the blessing that made him the sole owner of the birthright. Isaac didn't know that happened at that time. He found out a little bit later that he had mistakenly given that blessing to Jacob, the younger son. Esau was left without anything. Esau had only one recourse, and what do you think that was? He swore to kill Jacob as soon as their father had died. Rebekah took it upon herself to do what? Tell Jacob to get out, leave, don't stay here. Go back to where we came from originally, to Haran. Originally, they had come from Mesopotamia, but Terah was still, and Terah's family was still up in Haran, and Rebekah had a brother there by the name of Laban. Go up to Laban. Here is the map of the trail of the travel that he had to do. He started out here in Beersheba and follows all the way here, all the way up here. This is 475 miles. That's a long trip. It tells us, the Bible tells us he got as far as Bethel the first day, which is remarkable because that's only 50 miles from Beersheba. But what must be going through his mind? Here he was a fugitive fleeing his brother. What future did he possibly have? He had nothing to look forward to except to go to an uncle and see if he could get some sort of a life from that uncle. But what happened that night when he fell asleep, he had this dream. He had this dream of the angels going up and down this ladder. And going up and down this ladder, at the head of the ladder was God. And God gave Jacob a blessing at that time. But God gave Jacob a blessing, saying that from you will come a nation. In other words, you are not alone in this world. It's true, you have taken your brother's birthright, probably not under the best of all circumstances, but things are going to work out well for you. And I think that's shown on the next slide. Behold, the Lord stood above and said, I am the Lord, the God of Abraham your father, and the God of Isaac, and the land to which you lie I will give to you and to your descendants. And your descendants shall be like the dust of the earth, and you shall spread abroad to the west and to the east, to the north and to the south, and by you and your descendants shall all families of the earth bless themselves. Here is this strange guy sleeping in the wilderness, and he gets this dream that he is going to be the ancestor of a whole nation. Now, those are two very basic ideas in the whole history of the Jews. And again, we find that God is the one that instigated both of these. The fact that they're going to end up in Canaan, and the fact that it's going to be Jacob's descendants that are going to be the nation that results. Next, we're going to jump to another one, jump to Moses. Now we get to a somewhat different situation. Moses, well, I'll tell you a little bit about Moses. I was going to spend about 2 or 3 months on Moses alone. I'm not going to do this. I had originally planned to finish Genesis and get right into Moses. When I started looking into Exodus and Leviticus and the Numbers, I realized that I had done a little bit too much in teaching you people about what was in the Bible, because all of a sudden this became very confusing. The reason it became very confusing is because when the books of Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers were written, were a very different time from the times that we're looking at. I decided we're going to have to really get an understanding of what was going on when those books that I just mentioned were actually written. Do you remember a few weeks ago that I started something that I said I'll get to again later on, that there were some divisions among the Jewish people in terms of the religion? There was a pro-Moses group and there was a pro-Aaron group. And when we understand that pro-Moses and pro-Aaron situation, then we can look at the books of Exodus and Numbers and understand them a lot better. For that reason, I'm leaving Moses off for now. But what about Moses? Well, again, here I'm assuming that most of you people are well versed in the Bible and you know about the fact that he was born a Jew, but his mother put him in a box, put him in the Nile River, and he was rescued by Pharaoh's daughter, and Moses was actually brought up in the court of the Pharaoh. Whoops. Oh, I did it. When he's about 40 years old, he gets himself involved in a murder. Actually, what he did is he murdered one of the Egyptians that was persecuting one of his fellow Jewish brothers. What happened is that somebody saw that and told Moses, hey, this is dangerous. And Moses decided to flee. Moses is up here. This period is at the period of Ramesses. He's up in this region where they were living. And Moses goes all the way down here to Midian, way on the other side of the Gulf of Aqaba. And he feels safe there. He stays in Midian for 40 years. For 40 years from the time he's about 40 years old until the time he's about 80 years old. What happened when he was in Midian? He met Jethro and married Jethro's daughter. He had 2 sons while he was there. And he also took care of Jethro's sheep. And I told that one day when he was taking care of the sheep, said, now Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law, Jethro, the priest of Midian. Get this priest of Midian. And he led his flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire in the midst of a bush. And he looked, and lo, the bush was burning, but it was not consumed. And Moses said, I will turn aside to see what this great sight, why is this bush not being burned? Well, you're all familiar with the burning bush. You saw a lot of artists. When the Lord saw that he turned to see God, God called him out of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. And he said, here am I. And then he said, do not come here and put off your shoes from your feet, for the place in which you are standing is holy ground. And he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. This verse is rather significant. It indicated that before the burning bush, before Moses comes on the scene, these people were worshiping God. Who was the God they were worshiping? Well, it was the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, God. They were worshiping Elyon. As a matter of fact, when we get to the story of Abraham, back to the story of Abraham, when Abraham goes by Jerusalem, Melchizedek, who was a priest of Elyon, actually comes out to meet Abraham, indicating there were people that were worshiping a God called Elyon. In this particular verse, what we're told is that when Moses was at the burning bush, you're now talking to the God who was the God of your father, the God of Isaac, Abraham, and Jacob. There's another picture of the burning bush. Like I said, artists had a lot of opportunity to work at that. And the Lord said, I have seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians and bring them out to the land of the good and broad land, the land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites, the Hittites, etc. And behold, the cry of the people of Israel has come to me, and I have seen the oppression in which they've been. Moses is called. He's called to do this. What was Moses' reaction? Oh boy, I'm anxious to do this. No. not unlike some of the others, he said, no, I'm not ready for this. And he had to be persuaded to do this. He wasn't prepared for the task that was ahead of him. Now, I'm going to tell you right now that there is something that comes up here that has prompted me to spend about 2 or 3 months on Moses and the early years of Moses and what we have in the story of Moses taking the Israelites in the wilderness. But it has to be told in terms of what we find in Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, and that is very much influenced by how that was written. That is something we're going to be getting into much more deeply later on. Well, I'll go very quickly. He's told that you're going to do that, but you're going to have to take your brother Aaron along. More on Moses later on. I'll tell you a little bit more about that pretty soon. Next person we're going to talk about is Samuel. Samuel is also a prophet. Does anybody remember Samuel being called? Well, we have to go all the way back to the beginning of the story. The beginning of the story in what regard? And that is in Samuel 1, 1 Samuel, chapter 1, verse 1, is the beginning of the history of the Israelites. That is where we get the very beginning of watching this nation develop with these first verses that we have in the book of Samuel. Next week we'll talk a little bit about 2 books that precede that, namely Joshua and Judges, and how they are related to the book of Deuteronomy, and these books are related to Samuel. But Samuel starts the whole business of the history. Samuel is not born yet. As a matter of fact, in this picture, Hannah, his mother, is pleading to have a son. Eli is the high priest at that time. High priest of what? He's the high priest of the people that are in the city of Shiloh. Because in the city of Shiloh is the Ark of the Covenant and the tabernacle that were with them when they were in the desert. After they crossed the Jordan River, they settled down in Shiloh. And this became the center of the religion, and you might say the beginning of the religion of the history of the Jews. Hannah is blessed with a son. As she had promised, that son would be dedicated to working in the tabernacle with Eli. And here we have Hannah presenting Samuel to Eli. One night, when Samuel was still a little boy, while he was in bed, he hears a voice calling him. He thinks it's probably Eli, and he goes to Eli, and Eli says, "No, that wasn't me." He says, "Wait for the voice to come again." The voice came again. It turned out to be the Lord. The Lord came and stood forth, calling as at other times, "Samuel, Samuel." Samuel said, "Speak, for thy servant hears." And the Lord said to Samuel, "Behold, I am about to do a thing in Israel, in which the 2 ears of everyone that hears it will tingle." Samuel is going to become a prophet and become a judge. Now, Samuel does not actually ever become a priest. He becomes a judge. It's kind of interesting to try to figure out what a judge is exactly. In the case of Samuel, it's a matter of his acting as a prophet. Now, we get the idea because of a groundhog and other things that prophets are supposed to do what? Predict the future. Now, actually, when you're talking about the word prophet, it's somebody who was speaking for God. Speaking for God. And this is what Samuel was entitled to do, or was entrusted to do. Speak for God. And he did when he was working in the tabernacle with Eli. He was God's spokesman. Now, Eli had 2 sons. The sons were Hophni and Phinehas, who were very wicked, to say the very least, and were warrior types, and they fit right into the times. At the same time that the Israelites were starting to come into Palestine, Down to the southeastern part of Palestine, another group was coming in, namely the Philistines. And during this period that we're looking at right now, which is about 1100 BC, the Philistines and the Israelites were constantly in battle. I'll briefly outline what happened here. The Philistines come all the way up to Shiloh. Now, where is Shiloh? Shiloh is way up in Ephraim. It's way up in the northern part. It's north of Jerusalem, quite a bit north of Jerusalem. They come all the way up there, and there's a battle between the Philistines and the Israelites. And, oh, it's a great story. We've got to get into it in some detail later on. But the Israelites lose. And the Philistines come in and destroy the city of Shiloh. As a matter of fact, that's the end of Shiloh as far as being the center of the religion of the Israelites. Now, Shiloh is mentioned other times, but it's always mentioned in terms of being a city that was devastated, was destroyed. What happened, however, is that not everybody in Shiloh was destroyed. Samuel escaped. He escaped and he went back to his home, which was in the southern part of Ephraim. We'll talk about that in just a moment. And something else happened. A number of the priests that were working with Eli, they're called the priests of Shiloh, they escaped. And they got out before the Philistines were able to come into Shiloh and destroy Shiloh. These priests of Shiloh had escaped to a little city not too far from Jerusalem, a city called Nob. And they settled themselves down in Nob. These were what? These were the priests of Shiloh, the people who had been instructing the people in terms of what the law was, in terms of how they got it in the desert when they were with Moses. Go into that in much greater detail sometime later this semester. I still like semesters. Samuel went back down to the south. Samuel judged Israel all the days of his life. He went on a circuit year by year to Bethel, Gilgal, Mizpah, and he judged Israel in all these places. And he would come back to Ramah, where his home was there, and he administered justice to Israel, and he built an altar to the Lord. Samuel was back down south there. Here's the itinerary. Now, I tried to find a better map, but right about down in here, guess what? That's Bethlehem. Samuel was not in a circuit that's very far out of Bethlehem. It's probably not too surprising that Jesse, David's father, and David's brothers were probably influenced by Samuel and got to know Samuel, and maybe that's how they got to know the Lord that had been in Shiloh. Shiloh had been the beginning of the Jewish religion there, but now it had moved down to the region around Bethlehem. Actually, we find out a bit later on that the relationship between Samuel and David was rather intense in a number of ways. Samuel originally had anointed Saul, a Benjaminite, to be the king, but Saul was not a good king. He disobeyed the Lord, and the kingdom was taken away from Saul, and Samuel was instructed to go to Jesse's home and anoint one of his sons as the new king. You all know the story, how all the boys went in front of Samuel. Not one of them measured up until the little boy from the shepherd boy David came in from the field. He was anointed the king. So from the very beginning, we find there's an association between Samuel, Shiloh, and David. In other words, David is becoming acquainted with the history of the Jews as far as Moses is concerned, Moses setting up the tabernacle and the Ark of the Covenant in Shiloh. We'll be talking an awful lot more about that later on, because it's very significant that David gets this Shiloh background and has this idea that Moses was the originator of bringing the Ark into Palestine, of setting up the tabernacle, and having the people governed by a set of laws Now we're going to jump way ahead to the book of Isaiah. Isaiah is I don't think there's anybody that hasn't heard about Isaiah, the prophet. In the year of King Uzziah, when Uzziah died, Isaiah says, I saw the Lord sitting upon the throne, high and lifted up, and his train filled the temple. And above him stood a seraphim, and each had 6 wings. With 2 covered his face, and with 2 covered his feet, and with 2 he flew. And one called to another, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. And the foundations of the threshold shook at the voice of him who called to the house and filled his soul. And he said, Woe is me, for I am lost. I am a man of unclean lips, and dwell in the midst of the people of unclean lives. Immediately, Isaiah recognized that he is not worthy to be listening to what he is hearing. Then one of the seraphims came to me, and having in his hand a burning coal, which he had taken with thongs from the altar, he touched my mouth and said, Behold, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away, and your sin is forgiven. I think I have a picture of that, of Isaac being touched by the coal, by the angels, held by the angel. Here's another one. Isaac, was he ready to be a prophet? Was he ready to speak for the Lord? No. He said, I'm not worthy of it. And what happens again is that God intervenes, and he now is worthy of it. Here's even a more famous picture, and I found any number of pictures of this one incident where Isaac is now made ready to act as a spokesman for God. Well, then he said, here I am, send me. And this section is very significant. And he said, go and say to the people, hear and hear, but do not understand, see and see, but do not perceive. Make the heart of the people fat, and their ears heavy, and shut their eyes, lest they see with their eyes, and hear with their ears, and understand with their hearts, and turn and be healed. Now, that's a very strange command. But what is happening is that Isaac is being well aware of the fact that the people in Israel, and this is about 700 BC, this is about 200 years after the times that we just talked about with Moses and the others. Actually, more than that, it's about 500 years later. And what we're finding is that the people are not following the laws of Moses at all. They're not perceiving what they should be perceiving. This is why I speak to them. Well, is that an important phrase? Well, let me go back here once. That particular part here is rather understandable, and it gets us into something that often happens. Where's that from? That's the New Testament. In the New Testament, we find that Isaiah is quoted. Isaiah is quoted this way. And Jesus said, when he was speaking to the people, this is why I speak to them in parables, because seeing they do not see, and hearing they do not hear, nor do they understand. And with them indeed is fulfilled the prophecy of Isaiah, which says, you shall indeed hear, but never understand. You shall indeed see, but never perceive. So what we find is that Isaiah is quoted in the New Testament. There's another place where he's quoted. Another thing that came to Isaiah, and Isaiah reports, is the following. And he said, oh, how long, Lord? He said, until the cities lay wasted without an inhabitant, and houses without men, and the land is utterly desolated. The Lord removes men from afar, and the forsaken places are many in the midst of the land. In other words, there's going to be a disaster. Well, Isaiah had some reasons for saying this. This was about the time that the Assyrians were getting ready to move into Jerusalem. Now, they did not move into Jerusalem. They have already destroyed the northern kingdom. And there is the possibility that there could be what? A disaster. Take a look at this, verse 13. Though a tenth remain in it, it will be burned again, like a terebinth or an oak, whose stump remains standing when it is felled. The holy seed is its stump. In other words, it may appear that Israel is lost. The Assyrians have lost it. But that's not the end. Let's take a look at this one, please. I wasn't too aware of this, but I found this to be interesting. Here's a stump of an oak tree. And what often happens in stump of an oak sees that there's enough life in that stump that something sprouts from it. And you ever see some sprouting coming from that stump? I think I have an even better picture here. No, there's one. There's one sprout, and here's another sprout. There shall come forth, this is from Isaiah again, there shall come forth a shoot from the stump of Jesse, and a branch shall grow out of his roots. And the Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him, and the Spirit of the wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and of might, and the Spirit of knowledge and the fear of the Lord. These are kind of interesting statements to be made in 700 BC. But what did the people in New Testament times think? Isaiah was talking about what? He was talking about Jesus. He was talking about the fact that a Messiah will come. And his delight will be in the fear of the Lord, and he shall not judge by what his eyes see, or decide by what his ears hear. But with righteousness he shall judge the poor, and decide with equity the meek for the earth. And he shall smite the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips he shall slay the wicked. Now this is Isaiah writing way back around 700 BC. Can you see that the people in the New Testament era would say, Isaiah is talking about what? Isaiah is talking about Jesus and about the Messiah. Even though Israel may be destroyed by the Assyrians, maybe later by the Babylonians, something will come from it. And further, Isaiah says that the root of Jesse shall come, and he who rises to rule the Gentiles, and him shall the Gentiles hope. In other words, there's going to be more than just the Jews involved, even the Gentiles. Now they find that way written in Romans. This is Rome. This is the New Testament again. And what do we find that's rather significant about the Christian religion compared to the Jewish religion? It moved out of the Jews into the Gentiles and became a religion important to the Gentiles. This should not surprise you. These are the number of New Testament citations of the different prophets. Isaiah is cited 22 times. Ezekiel, Jeremiah, Elijah, the other important prophets we'll speak about in a moment, 2 and 3 times, that's all. But Isaiah 22 times. Now, I'll have to admit a bit of slothness on my part. I did not look up all 22 of these, but I plan to do that. I'd like to find out just what it is said in the New Testament about those other, that we find in the book of Isaiah, that's so significant that it's cited 22 times. However, what I can do is show you a little bit more, and that is that the book of Isaiah actually is about 60-some chapters long, but it's only the first 39 chapters that deal with Isaiah, the Isaiah at the time of Hezekiah. Chapters 40 through 55 I call Deutero-Isaiah, second Isaiah. Proto-Isaiah, the Hezekiah Isaiah, was written around 700 BC. The Proto-Isaiah was written at the time that the Jews were in Babylon as exiles. It's very obvious that they were exiled at that time. It's about 70 years later. In addition to that is the triple Isaiah, a third Isaiah. These are also part of the book of Isaiah. I won't go into this too far other than to point out some of the things that you may be familiar with. Isaiah 40 is in Deutero-Isaiah. How many of you are familiar with this? How many of you ever listened to the Messiah? The first part of the whole Messiah, Handel's Messiah is taken right from Isaiah 40. Comfort ye my people, and where every valley shall be lifted up, and the glory of the Lord. If you've ever sung in the Messiah, you would remember. Anyway, what we find very strong evidence of what is in Deutero-Isaiah pertains to the Israelites that were in Babylon, and that better times are to come. Trito-Isaiah gets into something a little bit further. Does this sound familiar? Yes, we're all quite familiar with it. He was despised and rejected of men. Surely has borne our griefs. Again, these are parts of the Messiah. Isaiah 66 goes even further, and it is written sometime after the Jews have returned, or as they say in the historical terms, the time of the Second Temple, the time after the temple had been rebuilt in Jerusalem, which be around 500 BC. Thus says the Lord, heaven is my throne and earth is my footstool. What is the house which you would build for me, and what is the place of my rest? It's talking about the temple. All these things my hand has made, and so all these things are mine, says the Lord. Again, talking about something that is in the future that is significant. These are all parts of Isaiah. What about Ezekiel? How am I doing? Oh boy. Ezekiel is very, very different in this regard. Ezekiel is a priest. He's a full-blown priest. Later on, you'll get the significance when I say that Ezekiel was a Zadokite. He actually was a great believer in the fact that Aaron was more important than Moses. But Ezekiel also has another advantage. Ezekiel also was with the Israelites that went to Babylon. He was with the group that went to Babylon in 598 BC. And Ezekiel speaks to the people that are in Babylon, and with the idea of giving them hope. How was he called? Well, he was called by a dream. Let's take a look at that dream. In the 50th year of the 4th month, and the 5th day of the month, I was among the exiles by the river Chebar, and the heavens were open. Chebar, where's that? Right in Babylon, the city of Babylon. In the 5th day of the month, it was the 5th year of the exile of King Jehoiakim. And the word of the Lord came to Ezekiel, the priest, the son of Buzzeh, in the land of the Chaldeans by the river Chebar, etc. And I looked, and behold, a stormy wind came from the south, and a great cloud with brightness around about it, and fire flashing forth continually. And in the midst of the fire, as were a gleaming bronze, and from the midst it came like the likeness of 4 living creatures. And this was their appearance, for they had the form of men. But each had 4 faces, and each of them had 4 wings. Can you envision that? Well, let's take a look at it once. Their legs were straight, and the sides of their feet were like the sole of a calf's foot. They sparkled like burnished bronze. And their wings on the 4 sides, and they had human hands. And the 4 had their faces, and their wings thus. Their wings touched one another, and they went, everyone straight forward, and turning as they went. Artists have tried to visualize this, we'll see in a moment. As for the likeness of their faces, each had the face of a man in the front. The 4 had the face of a lion on the right side. The 4 had the face of an ox on the left side. And the 4 had the face of an eagle on the back. And such were their faces, and their wings were spread above, and each creature had 2 wings, each which touched the wings of the other, while they covered their bodies. Well, there's that creature. Some artist tried the very best he could. Now, I don't know whether I have the verse that says something about this. I do not, unfortunately. But this is also the section where he talks about this. What is that? Wheel within a wheel. I'll tell you what, that's a very interesting situation. Why would there be a wheel within a wheel? One of the explanations that I was given in one of the commentaries is that this would be evidence of the power that God had to go in any direction he wanted. It wouldn't make a difference. A wheel can only go in one direction if it's a single wheel. But if there's a wheel within a wheel, it can go in different directions. Along with that commentary was something that I did not know. But in shipping rooms, in our modern world today, there are shipping carts that have wheels that are the wheel within a wheel that can go forward and can go at right angles, making use of this idea. Actually, what this means, nobody really knows. I will say this, though, there's an awful lot of people that are speculating that this wheel within a wheel that he saw was a circular sort of thing that maybe very well have been, well, it could have been a flying disc. I won't say any more about that, other than the fact that a lot of people have speculated that this may be what he was looking at. These are some pictures that artists have done in trying to typify this. The other thing that people remember about Ezekiel is this. The hand of the Lord was upon me, and he brought me out by the Spirit of the Lord, and set me down in the midst of a valley, and it was full of bones. And again he said to me, prophesy to these bones, and say to them, O dry bones, hear the word of the Lord. Thus says the Lord, the God of these bones, behold, I will cause breath to enter you, and you shall live. Well, what we are told is that the bones did connect each other. What is he talking about here? Ezekiel is talking about something that's in the future. It may be that we look like we're in a valley of dry bones, but guess what? The bones are all going to come to light. It may be that we are in a situation where we're desperate in Babylon at this time, but something will come of this. And he's talking about things that look brighter in the future. As a matter of fact, what we find is that we call it. Oh yeah, this is another interesting part of his life. In order to know what he has to say, he said, I don't know what to say. And the Son of Man, God said to the Son of Man, eat what is offered to you, eat the scroll. And the Son of Man will eat the scroll, and then he will go out and will be able to speak the words. We have several pictures of Ezekiel eating the scroll so that he will know what to say. This is a paragraph that I found on a commentary that I thought was very, very significant. Ezekiel powerfully depicts the grandeur of the glory of God's sovereign rule and his holiness, which he jealously safeguards. The book's theology centers in the unfolding of God's saving purpose in the history of the world, and from the time in which he must withdraw from the defilement of his covenant people to the culmination of his grand design. The message of Ezekiel is ultimately eschatological. It anticipates what's going to be in the future. It talks about the better times that are to come. I read some of these. It's really quite interesting. He talks about how people will be looking at things very differently in the future time, actually indicating there might be actually Gentile working with Jew. I did find rather interesting that there was a little bit of Ezekiel's background as a priest, as a Zadokite priest, because he does go into the trimmings of the temple. I'll talk more about that sometime in the next couple of months. Another prophet was Jeremiah. One of the things that's interesting about Jeremiah is that outside of David, we know more about Jeremiah than anybody else in the Old Testament. Did you know that? there is more evidence of what Jeremiah did and what Jeremiah said than about anybody else in the Old Testament except David. There's an awful lot written about David. Jeremiah became a prophet very early. He was called by God to be a prophet, and he prophesied. The words of the Lord, the son of Hilkiah, again, this was a priest, of the priests who were in Anathoth, in the land of Benjamin. Remember that name, Anathoth. You're going to hear it over and over again in the next few months. To whom the word of the Lord came in the days of Josiah. Who was Josiah? Josiah was one of the last of the kings of Judah, son of Amon, son of Judah. And it also came in the days of Jehoiakim, the son of Josiah, and of Zedekiah. Again, they were sons of Josiah. These were the last kings before the Israelites went into captivity under the Babylonians. This was the time that Jeremiah got the call to become a prophet, and he prophesied. One of the things he prophesied, he said, the word came, says, I will see a rod of almond. I won't go into that one. And the word came to me a second time, saying, what did you see? And I see a boiling pot facing away from the north. And the Lord said to me, out of the north shall evil break forth upon all the inhabitants of the land. This was when Jeremiah was still quite young. And what he was predicting in that boiling pot here was that, well, I'll tell you what, was that, time is getting short here. There was worry about these people that were in this area, the Scythians. They were a threat. Early in Jeremiah's life, the terror of the people in that part of the world at that time were the Scythians, who were constantly moving south. And Jeremiah made the prediction this was something that they would have to worry about. The Scythians were tremendous horsemen and great warriors. I'll just stop at that point. But it didn't happen. It didn't happen, and nothing happened with the Scythians. The Scythians didn't come. Later on, there were people that said, well, really what Jeremiah was talking about was the Babylonians were going to come. The Babylonians did come, but it was about 30 or 40 years later. And Jeremiah sort of fell in disfavor because he had made a prediction and he was wrong. He was very wrong. I found it kind of interesting to think about that aspect one time, and that is that very often you'll find people that are very influential, as Jeremiah was, will often have some tin cans tied to their tail. In other words, they will have probably made mistakes at one time or another. I remember talking to a friend of mine who was a very, very gifted administrator, and I think I told Carl this before, said being an administrator is not difficult at all. All you have to do is to make decisions, but then be right 51% of the time, which means you will make mistakes. Jeremiah made mistakes in this regard. That didn't happen with the Scythians. Can you think of somebody else who was very famous in our history who made a tremendous mistake early in his life and then redeemed himself? Winston Churchill. Remember what Churchill had done in World War I? He had advised a campaign that would take him through the Straits of Dardanelles that would help defeat the Germans in World War I. And what happened when they got to Dardanelles, the British soldiers were killed. I think 24,000 of them were killed. Churchill at that time was still a young man who was in the Department of the Navy of the British government, and he was, he was essentially finished. As a matter of fact, as I understand it, after that fiasco, Churchill actually went into France and fought in the artillery and on the front lines. But later in World War II, guess who comes to the fore? And again, we find that Churchill, he made mistakes at one time, but does become important. This becomes true also with Jeremiah. He may have made a mistake about the Scythians, but later on we find out that Jeremiah becomes very significant for another reason. He was there in Jerusalem and was able to see firsthand just what was happening when the Babylonians came into Jerusalem. Not only was he getting able to write a first-hand account of this, but he actually was a participant. There were parts of the things that happened in Jerusalem that Jeremiah, the prophet, was actually participating himself. Again, this is something we'll talk about rather extensively at some later time. Well, I can give you a little bit of a hint. Next week when we talk about the history, biblical history, we're going to find out that Jeremiah plays a very significant part, and that we think that Jeremiah may have very well been responsible for an awful lot of what we have in our written Bible today in the what we call the Deuteronomic histories. Then I want to move on. I've got 5 minutes. Elijah is very different. Now, why is Elijah different? Well, first of all, Elijah comes about 880 BC, very early after the division of the north from the south. After the northern tribes of Israel, the 10 tribes, separated themselves from Judah. Judah's down to the south. Judah and Benjamin are in the south. The northern tribes, or what they call Israel, now is a nation unto itself. Actually, we get ourselves oriented toward looking at things that happened in Judah, but Judah was the poorer of these two. The 10 tribes in the north were living in a much better part of Palestine at that time, and they had a lot going for them. Elijah was a prophet at that time. Now, I have quite a bit on Elijah here. I'll just show you how much I've got on Elijah. But I'm not going to talk about it now. When I got started on this, I remembered something that I had planned to do a year or so ago, and that was to talk about certain people that we have in the Old Testament, centering only on those people themselves, and not get too many of the other stories involved unless they are directly related to the people that we're looking at. The people I had in mind at that time were the following. Jacob. Why? Because Jacob had been in so many places. He starts out in Beersheba, he goes up to Haran, he comes back to Palestine, and he goes down to Egypt, and he dies in Egypt. Another one was Moses. I had already done Moses. I got Moses all ready for us to get going on. Another one was Jeremiah. As I indicated, Jeremiah was very instrumental in what was going on at the time that the Babylonians took over in Jerusalem. And it's very interesting to read about the things that Jeremiah writes himself about what had happened there. And the other one was Elijah. Why Elijah? Well, because we don't have that much about what went on in those northern tribes, except what we have in the book of 1st and 2nd Kings. And among those stories that we have in 1st and 2nd Kings are the stories concerning Elijah. Let me see if I can get back. Elijah, actually, I think it starts in chapter 17 of 1st Kings, and I think we can find as far as we go into 2nd Kings, 4th and 5th chapter. Elijah was a prophet during the time of King Ahab and Jezebel. Have you heard those names before? And what we're going to look at is that whole history that has been recorded rather nicely in 1st and 2nd Kings about what went on during the time of Elijah. Here are Elijah's travels. What we have here is the fact that Elijah probably started out his life in this area, and he goes all the way to the north, and at one point we find that he goes all the way down to Mount Sinai. He travels a lot, and he has a lot of contact with God. And If I got the right thing here. There's one little passage in Kings where we find that something happens when Elijah, the prophet, is in contact with God. And he said, "Go forth and stand in the midst before God, and behold, the Lord passed by, and a great and strong wind rent the mountains, and brake into pieces the rocks before the Lord. And the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire. But the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a still small voice." Does that ring a bell? This we find in the book of Kings. It was one of the times when Elijah actually has contact with God. We do not get in the book of Kings how Elijah was called. Elijah suddenly shows up in this fashion. Elijah shows up in having talked to Ahab the king, and Ahab was out to kill him. That's the beginning. We'll talk more about this next week and the following week. Elijah is one of those that I've planned to spend quite a bit of time trying to find out more about. Part of the reason, because the source that Deuteronomist had in writing about Elijah had to come from a very interesting place. It had to come from what they call the annals of the books of the annals of the kings of Israel, which we do not have available, but the Deuteronomist, the Deuteronomic history, had to interpret what he read about something that had happened 200 years before. This is what we'll get started on next week, and taking a look at the whole Old Testament in terms of where we find things about the history and why some of the material that we find concerning the history of the Israelites seems to be a bit muddled. But it sort of falls in place when we know when we do one thing, and that is when we look at a passage in the Bible, we ask ourselves, who wrote this? When did they write this? Why did they write this? And how did it get incorporated in the Bible? That will be the rest of the semester.
Thanks for